well, last but not least, I would now like to call on Dr. Marthie Momberg. Marthie, welcome. Marthie is a researcher at the Beyers Naudé Center for Public Theology and the Unit for Moral Leadership. The Beyers Naudé Center is based at the Stellenbosch University in Western Cape, South Africa. And well, Marthie, to you now.
Thank you, Martin, and thanks to all of the organizers for this wonderful event. It's a huge privilege also to listen to the other speakers. Well, as time is limited, I'm going to get into it immediately. I was asked to talk about the South African Kairos document of 1985 specifically, and the theologies that it identified. So just as an introduction, I want to say that like Nancy and Chris and Aruna highlighted, my entry point is to say that we live in an era, not only in a decade or 2 decades, but in an era of extreme alienation, inequality, polarity, and othering. And we see it on so many levels, but we also, and this is what I want to talk about, we also see it between what people of faith profess and what they actually do. So this means, in other words, Christians choose different sides in situations of upheaval. And when I reflect on the South African Kairos document of 1985, I have in mind 2 questions. The first is, how does one recognize the dynamics of deceiving theologies in contexts of oppression and prolonged violence? And what may be a responsible theology in such contexts? Now, the Kairos document has actually a lot to say about the notion of violence from a theological perspective. I must highlight that this document did not draw on international law or on any other sources. It's a theological perspective. So in my country, about 40 years after apartheid became enshrined in South African law, the crisis here became one of life and death. Decades of being held neck down by unjust force and authority spilled over in the streets. One black township after another revolted against the knee, what I call the knee of apartheid, facing death by the day as the apartheid army moved into townships to rule by the barrel of the gun. In July 1985, the government declared a state of emergency. Now, by that time, international support for boycott, divestments, and sanctions against South Africa was well underway, and there was also a UN resolution that had asked all states to not engage in cultural, academic, sporting, artistic, or any other exchange with a country. But not all agreed with this. The United States and Israel, for example, remained fiercely loyal to the apartheid regime, and in South Africa, both the oppressor and the oppressed claimed loyalty to the Christian faith. So it is within this brutal reality and the divisive loyalties between Christians and a desire for hope that a group of mostly Black South Africans came together over a period of weeks to interrogate the prevailing theologies. Is it legitimate, they asked, especially in our circumstances, to use the same word violence in a blanket condemnation to cover both the ruthless repressive activities of the state and the desperate attempts of the people to defend themselves? And I'm thinking of what you have just said, Aruna. So in their statement challenge to the church, a theological comment on the political crisis in South Africa that then became known as the South African Kairos document, the authors described 3 kinds of theological responses that I would like to just briefly explain. The first is called state theology, and maybe one can summarize it as the God of superior weapons. In state theology, Christians interpret biblical texts literally, and they do so to rationalize absolute loyalty to an abusive state. So this is hardly new, for the authors knew that such abuse of the Bible throughout the history of Christianity has been used to legitimize totalitarian regimes and to promote an attitude of blind obedience and absolute civility. In this respect, particularly Romans 13, verse 1 to 7 is often used to turn the state into a God-ordained entity, exempt from universal values, laws, and any critique. In other words, here Christians side with political agendas to enforce, to sanction, and this is very important, to normalize the status quo of a militarized, conquering, godlike state that discriminates, uproots, exploits, impoverishes, and destroys. Also kills, also kill with, when I say destroy. In effect, the state blesses, and I'm quoting here from the document, the state blesses injustice, canonizes the will of the powerful, and reduces the poor to passivity, obedience, and again, this is very important, it reduces the poor or anyone who objects into apathy. So anyone who dares to oppose the state, and this is what we must expect when we speak up, anyone who dares to oppose the state is accused of wrongdoing and vilified as being part of a tyrannical, totalitarian, I'm quoting again, a tyrannical, totalitarian, atheist, and terrorist communist regime, a kind of hell on earth dispensation. So this God of superior weapons, and in the South African context of tear gas, sjamboks, bombs and bullets, and I quote again, dispossesses black people of their land and gives the major part of the land to his chosen people. So in our context too, the Bible was abused to promote the superiority of white people as the chosen people. We were supposed to bring the light to South Africa. So this pact between state and theology values some lies more than others, and the authors deemed it both heretical and blasphemous. The next kind of theology is equally dangerous. It looks more civilized, but it's very, very shrewd and dangerous. And I can perhaps summarize it as the so-called neutral God. Church theology calls for dialogue, for negotiations, for reconciliations and peace, but it does so in an absolute manner, because it talks of oppression as if it is an even-handed clash that requires neutrality, balance, and fairness to both sides. But it does not take asymmetric power into account. It does not foreground the importance of justice, and it lacks adequate socio-political analysis. Church theology, and we need to ask ourselves who practice church theology. Church theology effectively sits on the fence, and this means it leaves the door wide open for more suffocation and the escalation of horror. In this theology, theologians use subtle, cautious ways of critique in support of so-called reforms, but without a clear call for an immediate end to the injustice. But the authors of the document, the Kairos document, argued that to reconcile justice and injustice, good and evil, God and the devil, is not only a mistaken application of the Christian idea of reconciliation, it is a total betrayal of all that Christian faith has ever meant. Our task as Christians, they said, is to do away with evil, with injustice, oppression, and sin, and not come to not to come to terms with it. So on the topic of violence, church theology condemns all violence. And this I know because I grew up as a white South African and Afrikaner of South African in fact. So I grew up with, I used to be a church theologian. It comes across as a neutral stance, but it is not. Because the word violence is mostly used for actions by protesters. State-sanctioned force, in turn, is called misconduct. At the most, atrocities. It's often called defense, but it's not called violence. In other words, church theology excludes the structural institutional violence of the state and all forms of psychological or mental harm, abuse, neglect, and maltreatment. These things are not counted as violence. And so the authors of the South African document, Kara's document, asked, and this is from my perspective a very, very powerful analogy. They asked, would it be legitimate to describe both the physical force used by a rapist and the physical force used by a woman trying to resist the rapist as violence? And then also with reference to the crisis of Dietrich Bonhoeffer in Nazi Germany, they concluded that there are times when physical force may be used against aggressors and tyrants, albeit as the very last resort or as the lesser of two guilts. But then they go deeper, the authors, and they ask themselves, well, why don't church theology develop a social analysis? Why is there an inadequate social analysis? And why does it make a virtue of neutrality? The heart of the problem, they said, is the split between worldly matters and spirituality, or between public and private matters that leaves, I quote again, that leaves so many Christians and church leaders in a state of paralysis. This divisive faith, which opposes a unity consciousness, has no biblical grounds, they argued. And in reference to Romans 8, verses 18 to 24, they say, for God redeems the whole person as part of his whole creation. The last theology that they identified is prophetic theology, which I think of as the transformative God. Prophetic theology calls for incisive discernment and action. And while the authors did not offer prescriptive steps, and although they made it clear that the document was not final and that it was meant to stimulate critical discussion, they did list several actions and points. And I would like to mention a few. I may, because of time, leave out a few, but I'll go through it quickly. The first is a thorough analysis of the nature and the dynamics of the system is necessary, together with any concomitant ideologies, paradigms, and practices. And the second point is to acknowledge the asymmetry. And here again, I want to, some of the earlier speakers alerted to this, that apartheid, that they said, I'm quoting from the document, it was very interesting to me when I read it. Apartheid is not a racial war between two equal races or races or nations, each with their own selfish groups. Okay, so it's not an equal thing. But they also say that it's not so much about the race. Yes, of course, race is a factor, but that's not to them, it was not the defining issue. They said that the defining issue is that it is an oppression, so it's asymmetry, and there are unjust interests and a just cause. So I think this also helps me to understand the notion of global apartheid and how apartheid is still rife in our world. The third point is that a tyrannical regime may be the official government and that the government could even be recognized as such by other states. It could even be recognized as a democracy. But in the Christian tradition, it has no moral legitimacy, because such regime is hostile to the common good and likely to be increasingly violent. And they surmised, of course, that the apartheid government in my country had indeed become the enemy of the people, and it had indeed become totalitarian and a reign of terror. And then they said that it's necessary to admit, and they make reference of concrete and vivid descriptions in the Bible, God is not neutral. Now, this does not mean a lack of concern for the perpetrator, but the perpetrator is called to repent. At the same time, there is no excuse for hatred. The Christian task is to love the enemy in the spirit of overcoming the dualism that enables separatism, and to recognize, of course, the humanity of both the oppressor and the oppressed. But it's not a compromise of our responsibility to vigorously oppose, confront, and reject injustice for the sake of the common good of all citizens. And with this in mind, they actually list very practical things in their context. They said that the oppressed have the right to ask churches for a message of hope. But it's not just about words. This hope needs to be confirmed, it needs to be maintained, it needs to be strengthened and spread again and again. At the same time, they called on Christians to join the struggle for a just liberation and peace through, for example, boycotts, stayaways, and other forms of civil disobedience. Churches should also reflect on the language and the words that they use in church services, in Sunday school classes, in Bible study groups, and in other activities, and ensure that it is in line with the ethos of prophetic faith. And then they said that the only way for Christians to come together to overcome the division between Christians is for Christians who sit on the fence, who think that they are neutral and that is a virtue, or who support a militarized God, to cross over and to be united in faith and action with the oppressed. So, just to summarize, the inclusive compassion of prophetic theology calls for a radical honesty. And I think when we talk about the radical honesty, it's not just something that you can ask someone to do. I think it's our responsibility to start thinking of creating safe spaces for people to unburden themselves and to become radically honest. And if you will allow me just a personal note, this is what happened to me. That my colleagues in Cairo, Southern Africa, created a safe space for me to not only to be honest, but to build my capacity and to start speaking up about the wrongs in my country and about my complicity for not doing anything to end apartheid. So prophetic theology calls for radical honesty, for incisive choices, for transformative ministry, for the critical evaluation of prevailing theologies, for repentance, and for co-struggle with the oppressed, because that is where God is to be found. This challenge, friends, to move from dualism and global apartheid to a spirituality of unity, and to embody this consciousness in our praxis, to inhabit the Casa Comun, as Nancy said, remains one of the biggest issues of our time. So the question is, where do we start? And are we able to unlock contexts of apartheid that were in place for decades? Who rules the world? What do we do? Thank you.
Thanks so much, dear Marcy, for your insights. I'm quite sure that the distinction between these theological concepts will help us on our way towards
Ja,
Kant.
genau, das war mir
So, given